Hello, my name is Matthew Dewey, and in this video I'm going to be giving you a post-apocalyptic story writing toolkit. Now, I've done many toolkits before covering other genres. Post-apocalyptic stories have existed for many years in one form or another, in different types of world spaces with different themes. However, there are some elements that are very common in the genre and need to be explored if you want to write your own post-apocalyptic story. I'm going to be going over these major elements today, and don't worry, I won't be going over something that's too specific that it won't apply to your post-apocalyptic story. When it comes to a lot of my writing videos, I leave a lot of room for your own creative freedom. You have your own ideas, your own characters, and story that you want to put together. But what I will be talking about is how these elements can help you create your post-apocalyptic story and how they can affect the established elements that you already have in mind. One of the first things you need to establish in your post-apocalyptic story is the cause of the apocalypse. It's great to figure this out early on because understanding what ended the world as we know it, whether it's nuclear war, climate change, a pandemic, an alien invasion, or zombies, will help you set the tone that you're trying to create in your story. The zombie apocalypse genre has existed for a while now, and it is one of the most enjoyed examples of post-apocalypse, as we have a threat that is very well known, it is popular, and it presents itself in such a way that it is scary and threatening, but not so threatening that it feels hopeless. And as you can imagine, establishing what caused your apocalypse will also decide the many elements that you do include in your story, as we'll discuss later. So you have a variety of options to choose from, and it really depends on you. You probably already have a good idea of what caused your apocalypse. The next point I'd like to bring up though is whether you want to make this cause an established fact, common knowledge amongst your characters, or more of a mystery as to how it came about. For example, an apocalypse where you have nuclear war is pretty much self-established. We can see conflict even today between major powerhouses in the world. So it's understandable for both the reader and the characters that a nuclear apocalypse might transpire. However, in more fantastical apocalypses such as aliens or zombies, well, that does raise a lot of questions as to how it was brought about. And you can establish this, but you also don't have to. The cause of the apocalypse doesn't have to be the center of your post-apocalyptic story. In every apocalyptic story, the world is defined by scarcity, which affects every aspect of life. So, depending on your apocalypse, you need to suitably limit the resources in your world space. Think about the availability of food, water, medicine, and technology. Consider how different groups or factions, as we'll talk about later, might adapt to this apocalypse, who might hold more resources than the other. Consider how these different groups or factions in your story might adapt to or exploit these shortages. I'll discuss the factions a little bit later. For now, the scarcity of resources should drive conflict and perhaps even plot development. Now, the point I made there about how your resources should be scarce depending on your apocalypse makes sense when you take a look at the different types of apocalypse out there. For example, if you're writing a robot apocalypse, you have an AI overlord who's taken over the world, and as a result has also taken hold of the technology that many people use. It's a popular post-apocalypse story because it takes away something that we as humans often rely on today. And to be without these things all of a sudden when we spent our whole lives living with them and using them, can leave us in a state where we just don't know what to do with ourselves. Many people can't survive in a world space where they don't have the technology that we do now. So they're very limited not only in resources but also the tools that they use. More than likely, they'll have to use more primitive weapons in order to combat this threat. You also got to think about what people make use of. For example, in the Mad Max apocalypse, most people are making use of cars, and while it is a desert apocalypse so water is valuable, gasoline, petrol is incredibly valuable as well. So don't ignore this element when it comes to your post-apocalypse story. think about what your characters might need and how this apocalypse could make that resource very rare, placing your characters in difficult and interesting situations that develop them further. Factions, as I typically call them, are caused when civilization has collapsed and new power structures and ideologies are established. These factions can be anything from tyrannical groups to cultish factions to the average Joe just trying to survive in this terrible situation. And these factions can be different in many ways. It could be ruled differently. Some could be ruled by a single individual, others could have a democracy. These factions could have different cultures, different rules, different goals. As a result, they will have different interactions when working with each other or working against each other. These factions could also be reflections of some modern-day factions we know so well. For example, different countries or different ideologies that exist today could exist in the post-apocalyptic world just under a different name and with a different presentation. There's nothing much more that I can say about this element other than that it helps to build the world space. It does require a bit more effort from you in the planning stages, especially if you want to make these factions believable in your world space. There's a reason that so many stories in this genre tend to focus on survivors, these broken up characters all over the world space who haven't formed any factions. It's much easier to work with these characters as they all just tend to work for themselves. They don't have some strange goal or culture that they're serving. They're all just trying to survive in a bad situation. So, it's believable and it's easier to plan for. However, if you want to take your post-apocalyptic story to the next level and perhaps venture forth a few years after the apocalypse, perhaps a few hundred years, then different societies will no doubt form. They will have different strengths and weaknesses, and that is entirely up to you. The fourth point is about the characters that are shaped by the apocalypse. Now, characters in these world spaces are typically survivors, and their personalities, skills, and motivations are deeply influenced by the situation they're in. So, focus on how the apocalypse has changed them. Are they hardened, cynical, or driven by hope? What skills have they developed in order to survive? Their backstories, their coping mechanisms, how have they dealt with loss, and what keeps them going in a world that's fallen apart? Now, this point doesn't have to focus on the characters that you already have in mind, your central protagonist, for example, but it's also the other characters, perhaps the characters leading the different factions that you might include in your story, that are incredibly important. They have their own motivations and experiences. Some people experience the apocalypse completely different from another. So that means that their perspective and the way they approach situations might be entirely different. Those with many resources may see it as more of an inconvenience, whereas those with little will see it as a dire circumstance that gives them the reason to do whatever they want in order to survive. The mentality of most of these characters will also be damaged in some way. An apocalypse is a traumatic event, and many people handle that trauma differently. However, while this does tend to complicate more two-dimensional characters, it also gives you an opportunity to include strange characters that fit in your world space. You can include these mad, odd characters and it will fit, because sometimes there are people who do lose their minds, or their personalities become a little more eccentric after experiencing such terrible events. One of my favorite elements in post-apocalyptic stories are the hazards. In a world space where cities have crumbled and governments have dissolved, there are many hazards that are formed in this apocalypse. If it's a nuclear apocalypse, perhaps toxic wastelands are fairly common. As a result, many characters need to wear special suits and gas masks to travel through certain regions in their world. If it's an extreme weather apocalypse, that means that there are going to be situations where they have to take to the underground, or perhaps to higher ground, depending on the weather itself. If it's flash floods, then getting to higher ground is important. However, if the world is being pummeled by storms, typhoons, or lightning, then taking to the underground might be a lot safer. These hazards could extend to alien creatures, or perhaps mutated monsters, where the common animals that we see today have become these strange creatures through nuclear radiation. There's a lot of fantastical creative freedom that comes with the genre, so don't be shy about creating your own unique threat for your world space. As a little writer's note here, the best way to present these hazards is to have one character who isn't so knowledgeable on them. Perhaps they're part of a faction that doesn't experience a lot of threats, or perhaps they are simply new to this world space. And to have another character who is experienced explain it to them, or at least help present the dangers of it to them in some way. By that I mean you have a character who tells your learning character directly what is going on and how to avoid it, or it could be a character who gets caught up in that hazard and the one who's learning learns from that one's mistakes. It's up to you to decide which way to present that information, show or tell. It's your story after all. That being said, I do encourage anybody writing this genre to show some decay of the old world, to present what once was to the characters in it. Remnants of the world before the apocalypse contrast and context how exactly everything transpired. For example, if a city was bombed, perhaps a massive crater within the city and ruined buildings that have been toppled over in the direction of the blast wave will give a pretty good indication of what happened in this world space. Perhaps your characters won't understand, but certainly your readers will. So describe the ruined cities, the abandoned technology, the overgrown landmarks. That is one important element too, as it not only establishes what has happened to the world space, but also where your characters are. For example, the Metro series, which I've talked a bit about on this channel, has the Kremlin featured whenever a character goes above ground. This establishes, well, it's already established there in Russia, but it establishes where they are in Russia. Take the Planet of the Apes, for example. When you have the Statue of Liberty or the Golden Gate Bridge, you kind of figure out exactly where your story is set without a character having to tell you explicitly that. The next points I want to talk about are the themes of hope versus despair, isolation versus community. Again, these are common elements in post-apocalyptic fiction, but they can also affect your characters and your story. You could have an isolated character in your world space who is cynical, but has then found community and hope through others. You could also have the exact opposite. You could have characters who have been disillusioned in a bad community, and as a result they have no hope, but they also have to cling on to others in order to just have something. So that's why they need to find strength within themselves through isolation, and through that strength they find hope. Those are two polar opposites, but you can find any combination that works for you. With the buildings crumbling to dust and everybody starting at square one, it's understandable for some to want to despair because they could have been so high in the world and now brought so low. For others, however, they can find the strength within themselves to continue to push forward and rebuild. And while hope and despair is very clear, you could also present these themes through isolation and community. There are many great stories in this genre that explore the strength through community, characters working together to survive their harsh circumstances. Metro, the book series I mentioned earlier, being an example of that. Because while there are some strong characters, it's really the characters working together that help them defeat such huge antagonists. Now you could have a character who's strong right at the start, or a character who learns as they go. That's up to you. But through that isolation, they have no other choice but to overcome the obstacles on their own, and as a result they can only get stronger. There is that popular joke concerning I Am Legend where he did survive many years on his own with just a dog, but then when other people got involved, well, it didn't end well for him. And now the final point I want to cover in this toolkit is the focus on realistic survival. Many authors out there who have taken to writing a story in this genre try to write something that's overly cliche and lacks the realism of survival that makes the genre so great. It's rather uninteresting to have characters who have all the resources they always ever need and never really have to try and MacGyver their way out of some incredibly tense situation. Makeshift weapons and armor are fairly commonplace, but also simple survival tactics like learning how to light a fire, find shelter, hunt for food, or find water, are incredibly important as well. Understand that not everybody in this world space is a superhero. These are normal people who have certain skills that no longer apply. So that means they have to learn the ones that can help them survive. A character who is wounded but doesn't know how to treat that wound, that could lead to infection or perhaps a loss of life in the future. Harsh decisions must be made, and sometimes the tactics one uses in order to escape trouble still have some loss involved. And I'm not just talking about a simple situation where a character ditches a heavy backpack of supplies in order to outrun a threat. I'm talking about the kind of situation where a character cuts off a limb in order to save themselves from zombie infection, or perhaps cauterizing a wound with a hot knife instead of just disinfecting it and wrapping it in a bandage. Remember, scarcity of resources is important. People are going to struggle, they're going to go hungry, they're going to have conflicts because not everything is working out the way they want it to. So understand the harshness of your world space and use these techniques in this toolkit to help you write the story that you want to write. If you are approaching the genre for the first time, I do hope this toolkit helps you. And if you are familiar with this genre and have some advice that you want to offer, please do so in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, happy writing.